Hello everyone in YouTube, this is Finalugia Guardian, also known as Lex Historia on vid.me, and today I am doing the long overdue Canon SL1 review. And it is long overdue and it better get done now because the Canon SL2 is on its way. Maybe I'll discuss more about that in a later video. I've already discussed it once in my predictions video, but maybe I'll discuss it more in a subsequent video after it's been released. So let's keep this review on the SL1 though, shall we? Alright, so I'm going to break this review up into two parts. This first part is going to be me discussing the specs of the camera briefly and how I use the camera and my thoughts on whether or not it'll be good enough for you. So let's start with the specs. This camera uses an 18 megapixel CMOS APS-C size sensor. Of course it's a 17.9 megapixel sensor, but we'll just round it to 18 and say 18 for this review because really it's really close to 18. This camera will shoot these 18 megapixel photos at a burst rate of 4 frames per second max. That's one less than the Canon 700D, which this camera was released alongside, but this camera is also much smaller and lighter than the 700D. So 4 frames per second I think is plenty. If people were good enough with 3 frames per second on the Canon T3i and T2i, this should be plenty for you as well. Now let's talk about the autofocus system for these photos. This thing uses an off-sensor phase detect autofocus system with 9 autofocus points, one of which in the center being cross-type, which means it'll be a more accurate autofocus point. So just think of it like that. Cross-type is better than non-cross-type autofocus points. That's different than the Canon 700D, which has 9 all cross-type autofocus points. So in total, it'll be a bit more accurate in its autofocus rather than just using a contrast detection autofocus point. Alright, now let's talk a little bit about the video. The video that this camera will shoot max is 1080p, 1920 by 1080p, at a frame rate of 30 frames per second at a bit rate of 44 megabits per second. And that uses an MOV container. So that's Apple's thing. It's not the MP4 that a lot of other cameras will shoot. But MOV is good enough for me. I've never had a problem with it. It does eat through cards faster than the camera I'm recording this with, the Canon Vixia R600. But it's still fine because I mostly use this for stills and not video anyway. Very sparingly do I use this for video. Alright, next thing we're going to talk about is the autofocus for video. This uses what's known as a hybrid autofocus system, which means that in video mode, it's going to be able to take advantage of this STM lens a lot better than an older camera that doesn't have a hybrid autofocus system, or the even better dual pixel autofocus system that you see on the Canon 70D and Canon 80D and Canon 77D and Canon T7i, and presumably the Canon 60 Mark II, which will probably have dual pixel autofocus. But we'll get into that probably in another video. Let's keep this on the SL1. This camera, as far as I can tell, the video autofocus on this has been good enough for me. It's very smooth, very responsive, probably more than good enough for you. Now, next thing we're going to do is discuss some of the external features. This thing has a pop-up flash, which is activated by pressing this button right here on the side. If I can just freaking find where that button is. Here it is. You press that button and the flash will pop up. And it'll give you the ability to use a little bit more light than you would have otherwise. However, be warned, using the flash will drain the battery faster than if you're just using the shutter and relying on your camera to gather light naturally from the natural light in your circumstances, which I think actually in general produces a better quality image than the flash anyway, but it's there if you need it. Use it if you have to. It's better than not getting the shot at all. And speaking of the battery, this uses the same EOS M series battery, the Canon EP12 I think is what it is. It'll give you a 340 shot amount, so 340 shots is what you get out of the battery, and then you have to change it. That's plenty for me. It'll probably also be plenty for you as well. This camera also features something that a lot of consumer-grade DSLRs don't, which is really surprising given how small this camera is. This thing has a mic jack on the side right here. It doesn't have a headphone jack, but in general, I just look at the camera's settings when I'm looking at my audio settings, and I just rely on that. I don't listen in to the audio from this camera, or any camera really. I just sort of trust what the camera says and go based on that. Besides, my hearing isn't precise enough to tell what's really good in minute details anyway. And besides, YouTube compresses the heck out of your video anyway, so any small little tweaks you do in your video are probably going to be muffled by the YouTube video compression, so make of that what you will. The next thing we're going to discuss is the, oh yeah, I mentioned before, this is the smallest and lightest weight DSLR on the market. To put things in perspective, this Canon SL1 Rebel DSLR is lighter than the Panasonic GH4, which is a quote-unquote professional camera. And I hear some of you saying, but wait a minute, the Canon SL1 isn't weather sealed like the GH4. The Canon Rebel doesn't have a headphone jack. The Canon Rebel doesn't have 4K video. The Canon Rebel doesn't have, once again, the Canon Rebel doesn't have a lot of things. But I hear you. Those are all valid points. But it is nice to have an actual DSLR with an optical viewfinder that's not constantly draining the battery like the GH4's viewfinder does, being electronic. So even though this thing has a smaller battery, you can leave this thing on, and then this camera will just go into sleep mode when it's not being used. And you can put it up to your eye, press this button down, and you're ready to go. And you don't even have to press this down. If you just want to look through the viewfinder to try and compose your shot, you don't have to press anything. You just look through the viewfinder, and what you see in the lens is what you're going to get. Now, once again, you're not going to be able to tell like if your exposure is right or if your ISO is set right so you don't get a really dark shot. It's just going to be the light that your eye sees. So really it's good for framing your shot, but as far as seeing what your shot is exactly going to look like, an electronic viewfinder would probably be more helpful. But once again, it's a trade-off. Do you want battery drain or a more accurate image of what your ultimate photo or video is going to look like? Pick your poison. Alright, the next thing we're going to discuss is basically the conclusion. So overall, I think the specs on this camera are good overall. They're more than good enough for the average user, which is what I am. I'm not a professional photographer. I don't do this for a living. I guess I'm what you would call an enthusiast photographer. And speaking of how I use it, let's get into how I use it. I use this camera mostly for photos. I very rarely use it for video. I don't shoot a lot of video, actually. And it's mainly for personal and family use, so like family photos, and then of course, if I want to take a really good photo of myself that is better than what my iPhone can produce, this is actually very nice to have. And how I take photos is I actually disable all but the center cross-type autofocus point. I found that actually with this Canon SL1, the autofocus points that are not cross-type actually can mess up your autofocus when used in conjunction with the center cross-type autofocus point. So what I recommend is when you're shooting photos of this, disable all the autofocus points except for the center cross-type. Just put your center autofocus cross-type autofocus points on your subject, focus the camera, and then recompose your shot, and then take the photo. And that'll produce more than a good enough image. It's a little bit tedious, but it's a workaround that I've learned to live with. And it's more than good enough for me. Also, I use this when I'm shooting photos. I use it in aperture priority mode most of the time. Sometimes I'll use manual, and sometimes I'll use shutter priority when it's really dark and I want to make sure to get as much light as I can. But most of the time I'm using aperture priority mode, and the aperture is set at either f6.3 or f7.1. That generally gives me a large enough depth of field to where I'm not worried about getting the subject out of focus, even when I am using the center cross-type autofocus point and then recomposing my shot. That still gives me a large enough depth of field to where I get the subject in focus, and it is sharp. Well, sharp enough. As sharp as this lens can produce anyway. I'll get into that a bit later. Alright. The video, I use the 180-degree shutter rule always, and I'm using the camera in manual mode for video. So what I do is I set it at 1080p, 1920 by 1080, at 30 frames per second, and then I use a 1/60th of a second shutter speed. And of course, I have to drop the aperture way down for bright days. So what I'll commonly do is use either f11 or f16 as my f-stop number when I'm shooting video on this thing. Which, of course, when you stop the aperture down that much, you are risking getting a little bit of diffraction, which will soften your image. But for 1080p video, I generally think that it's still okay, even at f16. you're not going to be making large prints off of an f/16 photo. This is for video only. So it's more than good enough for video, I think. And especially on bright days. I'm really grateful for that. And as I mentioned earlier, the lower aperture will give you a larger depth of field, which means that more of your video is going to be in focus. So if you want to do a landscape pan, is what I call it, pretty much everything in your shot is going to be in focus at f/16. So I find that actually to be very useful, despite the little bit of diffraction you risk getting. But once again, 1080p video, you're not going to be able to see all that detail lost when you're just scaling down to effectively 2 megapixels worth of resolution for the video anyway. So make of that what you will. Now let's get into the lenses that I use in this thing. I mostly just use the standard 18 to 55 millimeter STM lens that came with this camera. I find it is good for like 90% of what I do. I actually do have one other lens for this camera. It is a 70 to 300 millimeter Canon EF lens, and I use that to take pictures of the moon. What I do is I just zoom that all the way into 300 millimeters. I put the ISO down as low as I can get it, and I put the shutter speed as high as I can get it, and I have the thing mounted on a tripod, and then I set it on a timer, a 2-second timer, which I take the picture, well, I set the camera to take the picture, and then let it count down 2 seconds, and by that time the camera shake has all died down, and I get a nice, clear, crisp picture of the moon. It's actually gotten some pretty good results on that, so I actually do recommend the 70 to 300 millimeter for that limited use. Now, for more general telephoto use, I would actually recommend you get the 55 to 250 millimeter EFS STM lens. That I think will produce better quality images, and it'll have a higher perceptual megapixel count than the 70 to 300 millimeter, which is a much older design and a much less sharp lens. But for me, the 70 to 300 millimeter is more than good enough for my purposes. And let's talk a little bit about this lens a little bit more. This thing actually has a perceptual megapixel count, according to DxOMark, of 9 perceptual megapixels. So this is an 18 megapixel sensor, and this renders effectively 9 megapixels worth of sharpness, which is fine for what I do. I've never printed anything larger than an 8x12 print, and most of the time I'm posting my stuff online anyway, and unless you're looking at something on a 4K monitor, of course that being a little over 8 megapixels worth of resolution, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the 9 perceptual megapixels you get on this, provided I, of course, composed my shot right and got the focus spot on. You won't be able to tell the difference between something shot by this and something shot by a Canon ATD with a Sigma 50mm art lens. That's the 1.4 art specifically. So that's basically going to be the short version of that. It's going to be a more than good enough lens for most purposes, and I do recommend it. So that pretty much concludes my review of the Canon SL1 Part 1. So check back next time. We'll check out the images on this camera. So until next time, take care. Peace.